carried the memory like a stone pressed deep in his chest. Years had passed since the day he slipped items into his bag, but time had not dulled the heaviness. If anything, the longer he carried the secret, the more it seemed to grow, like shadows stretching across the floor as the sun sinks low. In his late 20s now, working odd jobs that barely covered his rent, he often thought about that small store. It wasn't a grand supermarket or some faceless chain. It was a modest family-owned shop, the kind where the owner greeted everyone by name, where shelves smelled faintly of old wood and freshly packed spices. Back then, he was desperate, his stomach empty and his pride shattered. He told himself it was survival, but the truth followed him home every night. It wasn't hunger alone that guided his hand, it was weakness. Shame lived with him quietly, like a shadow no one else could see. He had moved to a different part of town, made new friends, and pretended to be just another man trying to get by. Yet, whenever he walked past a store, the reflection in the glass reminded him of what he had done. Every kind gesture from strangers only deepened the guilt, as if the world was showing him kindness he had not deserved. There were nights when he would sit alone at his small kitchen table, staring at his meager paycheck. The idea of paying back what he had stolen gnawed at him, but it was not only about money. How could he repay the look on the shopkeeper's face, a man who had probably trusted his customers without suspicion? How could he return the dignity he had stolen from himself that day? He dreamed sometimes of walking back into that shop, placing everything he took on the counter, and saying, "Here, this was yours, and I am sorry." But those dreams ended the same way, with the shopkeeper's disappointed eyes, or worse, with anger, rejection, even the police. He convinced himself that it was too late, that some mistakes were beyond repair, and yet, something inside him whispered that the only way forward was through the very door he feared to open. He began to put aside a little money from each paycheck. It was not much, but over time, a small envelope grew thicker with folded bills. It wasn't just repayment he was saving for. It was redemption, an attempt to return not just the items but a piece of himself he had lost. Still, each time he counted the bills, doubt rose like a tide. Would it even matter? Would forgiveness be possible? The weight of guilt never left him, but slowly, it began to push him forward instead of holding him back. He realized that hiding was another form of theft, stealing the chance to make things right. He chose a gray morning when the sky felt low enough to touch. The envelope of bills sat like a warm coal in his pocket, and in his other hand he carried a small notebook where he had written every item he remembered taking. The chime above the door still sang the same tiny note when he stepped inside. Shelves of spices and canned goods lined the narrow aisles, the air sweet with cardamom and dust. He stood there a beat too long, as if time had folded and left him in the first moment of his mistake. The owner was behind the counter, older now, hair thinner, and the lines at his eyes deepened by years of dawn openings and late closings. He looked up, met the trembling in the young man's gaze, and paused. Recognition did not strike like lightning. It moved more like a slow tide, the kind that takes a moment to rise against a shoreline. The young man reached the counter, placed the envelope and notebook down, and explained. He did not use excuses. He told the story like a weather report, facts carried by a steady voice that still shook beneath its calm. Hunger had been real then, but so had pride, fear, and that small voice that said no one would notice. The owner listened without crossing his arms, without leaning back as if to shield himself. He listened the way shopkeepers do, with patience shaped by thousands of small conversations. When the young man finished, he waited for anger to arrive, or judgment, or the sound of a phone being lifted to call someone who would make this a matter of law. Instead, the owner asked how long he had been saving, and whether the list felt complete. The questions were practical, almost tender. The young man answered, and the words came easier than he expected, like a knot loosening. There was a silence that felt like a held breath. The owner took the notebook first, not the money. He traced a finger down the items, nodding at brands, quantities, small notes in the margins. He looked up, seeing not just the past, but the work that had gone into facing it. He spoke quietly, and the young man heard a simple truth wrapped in gentle firmness. Money mattered, but trust had been the thing stolen, and trust could not be returned in a single morning. It had to be carried back, piece by piece, like cans on a shelf. The owner slid the envelope toward the young man and rested a hand on the notebook instead. He said they would begin with restocking, cleaning, whatever needed doing. He said he would keep the list as a ledger of progress. The young man felt the shame inside him tilt, not vanish, but shift its weight, so it no longer pinned him to the floor. When he stepped behind the counter to follow the owner into the small back room, the chime above the door sang again, and this time it sounded less like an alarm and more like a bell calling someone home. Days turned into weeks, and the young man returned to the shop each morning, carrying more than just the money he had saved. He carried effort, humility, and a willingness to face himself. He learned the rhythm of the store, the soft creak of the floorboards, the smell of the paper bags, the stories behind each customer's purchases. Every task became a way to repay not only what he had taken, but the trust that was slowly being rebuilt. He noticed small things along the way, how the owner greeted regulars by name, how he remembered the birthdays of his employees, how he found joy in simple gestures. It dawned on him that repayment with interest wasn't about numbers. It was about giving more than what was lost, offering care, attentiveness, and honesty to make up for the breach. Each day, he began to see the gap between who he had been and who he wanted to become. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, the owner stopped him mid-task. He handed him a small box of baked goods, insisting he take them home. There was no lecture, no reprimand, just a quiet acknowledgement that effort and sincerity mattered more than punishment. In that moment, something inside him unclenched, a weight lifting he hadn't realized he had carried for years. Redemption was not a grand gesture, but a steady series of small acts, each one adding up to a life restored. He reflected on the irony how shame had been both a burden and a compass, guiding him back to a path he had long abandoned. The people around him noticed the change too, his co-workers, neighbors, even strangers in the shop. There was a new calm in his presence, a warmth that was neither boastful nor desperate, but quietly confident. It was the self-respect he had been denied when he chose the easier, shame-filled path. When he finally tallied all he had returned, everything was accounted for, and yet the sense of completion felt larger than a sum of money or items. It was the intangible repayment the trust regained, the lessons absorbed, the transformation recognized by both himself and the man who had first seen him falter. He realized that the true interest he had added was in becoming a better person, one who could face the world without hiding from the past. Standing by the door, watching a young family leave with bags in their hands and laughter in the air, he felt a quiet gratitude. Mistakes had led him here, yes, but the courage to return what was lost had shaped the man he was becoming. Life had given him a rare gift, the chance to repair what he had broken and, in doing so, to find peace. And for the first time in years, he smiled without guilt, knowing he had done more than he owed. He had given back his heart, with interest. Sometimes, returning what we owe with interest is not about money or objects, it's about restoring trust, reclaiming dignity, and giving ourselves the chance to be better. Take a moment to reflect on your own journey. If this story moved you, share it, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.